A racist cop hits the old man with a baton, then was taught the lesson of his life. Officer Ryan, a young and arrogant cop, patrolled the streets of his small town with an iron fist and a sharp tongue. Known for his prejudice and quick temper, he believed his badge granted him the authority to humiliate anyone he deemed inferior. But one fateful evening, he made a mistake that would change his life forever. It was just another routine patrol for Ryan when he spotted an elderly man struggling to cross the street with a worn-out cart filled with books. The man's frail figure and shabby clothes only fueled Ryan's disdain. Without hesitation, Ryan approached him, his baton already in hand. "Hey, old man! Clear the street! You're blocking traffic!" Ryan barked, his voice echoing with authority. The elderly man, Mr. Samuels, turned slowly, his weathered face calm but tired. "I'm almost across, officer," he replied politely, his hand trembling as he gripped the cart. But Ryan wasn't one for patience. With a sneer, he raised his baton and struck the cart, causing it to topple over, books scattering across the street. The man stumbled back, clutching his side as Ryan muttered, "Maybe that'll teach you to move faster." Unbeknownst to Ryan, a small crowd had started to gather, and among them stood someone who wouldn't let this injustice slide. That moment would mark the beginning of a lesson Ryan could never forget. The crowd around the scene began to grow, murmurs of disbelief spreading as they watched the frail old man struggle to gather his scattered belongings. Ryan stood tall, baton in hand, his expression unbothered by the judgmental stares. He had always believed that his authority as a police officer placed him above reproach. "Mind your business, folks," Ryan barked at the onlookers, his tone dismissive. He was in the way, and I had to handle it. Among the bystanders was Maria Johnson, a local teacher in her mid-30s who was known for her strong sense of justice. Maria's piercing eyes locked onto Ryan's smug face, and a fire of determination ignited within her. She stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "Officer, was that really necessary?" "He's just an old man," Maria said, folding her arms as she glanced at Mr. Samuels, who was now on his knees, painfully trying to retrieve his books. Ryan turned to Maria, narrowing his eyes. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. I'm maintaining order here." "It's everyone's concern when someone abuses their power," Maria shot back, her voice growing louder. "This man deserves respect, not violence." Ryan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Mr. Samuels slowly stood, one hand clutching his side. He looked at Maria with gratitude before addressing Ryan in a calm but firm tone. "Young man, I've lived through a lot worse than you. But this isn't about order. This is about respect. Something you clearly lack." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Mr. Samuel's words and Maria's defiance. Ryan, however, refused to back down. "Respect is earned, not demanded," he snapped, stepping closer to Mr. Samuels. "And if you can't follow simple rules, you won't get any from me." Maria's patience snapped. "Enough! Someone needs to report this," she exclaimed, pulling out a phone to record the incident. "Put that away," Ryan barked, his tone laced with panic as he tried to block the camera with his hand. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," Maria said, her voice unwavering, exposing the truth. As tension filled the air, a voice from the crowd chimed in. "You're making a mistake, officer," said a tall, imposing man who stepped forward. It was Thomas, a retired police chief who had once been Ryan's mentor. His sudden presence silenced the murmurs and sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. "Thomas?" Ryan asked, his confidence wavering for the first time. "Officer Ryan," Thomas began, his voice low and controlled. You've crossed a line, and you're about to learn a lesson you'll never forget. Ryan froze as Thomas turned to Mr. Samuels and Maria. I think it's time we set this right, he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority and justice. The street was heavy with tension as Thomas stepped closer to Ryan, his steady gaze piercing through the young officer's hardened exterior. The crowd, now silent, watched with anticipation. Ryan's grip on his baton tightened, his usual arrogance faltering in the presence of his former mentor. You're overstepping, Chief, Ryan said defensively, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. I was just doing my job. Thomas shook his head slowly. Your job is to serve and protect, Ryan. What I saw just now was neither. You think that badge gives you the right to treat people this way? Ryan's lips thinned into a straight line, but before he could respond, Thomas turned to Mr. Samuels, who was still clutching his side. Mr. Samuels, are you all right? Thomas asked gently. I'll be fine, the old man replied, though his labored breathing and pained expression told a different story. Maria stepped forward, still recording. He needs medical attention, she insisted, her voice brimming with determination. And this officer needs to be held accountable. Ryan rolled his eyes, trying to mask his growing unease. Fine, call an ambulance if you want, but I didn't do anything wrong. You don't get to decide that, Maria shot back. We all saw what you did. Thomas raised his hand, signaling for calm. Enough, he said firmly. He turned back to Ryan, his tone sharp. You think this is about being right or wrong in your eyes. It's about how your actions reflect on the badge you wear. And right now, you're a disgrace to it. The crowd murmured agreement, and Ryan's face reddened with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to retort, but Thomas wasn't finished. Mr. Samuels, Thomas said, gesturing to the cart of scattered books. What are these for? The old man smiled faintly, despite his discomfort. I run a little free library for the neighborhood kids, he explained. These books are donations I've been collecting for months. I was taking them to the community center. A ripple of admiration swept through the crowd, and Maria's expression softened. That's incredible, Mr. Samuels, she said. You're making such a difference. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how his actions had disrupted something good. Look, I didn't know you both, he muttered, his voice barely audible. You didn't bother to know, Thomas snapped. And that's the problem. As the tension grew, the sound of sirens pierced the air. An ambulance pulled up and 2 paramedics stepped out, making their way to Mr. Samuels. Let's get you checked out, one of them said kindly, helping the old man onto a stretcher. Maria stopped recording and approached Thomas. Chief, this can't just end here, she said. What happens next? He can't get away with this. Thomas nodded, his face grim. Ryan will face the consequences, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. But first, he's going to understand exactly what he's done. Thomas looked back at Ryan. You're coming with me. What? Ryan exclaimed, his eyes wide. Why? You'll see, Thomas replied. He gestured to the paramedics. Take Mr. Samuels to the hospital, and we'll meet him there. As Mr. Samuels was taken away, Thomas led Ryan to his car. Maria followed, determined to see this through. Ryan reluctantly climbed into the passenger seat, fuming but too intimidated to argue. The drive was tense and silent. Ryan stared out the window, his mind racing. Thomas finally broke the silence as they pulled into the parking lot of a small, modest building. Where are we? Ryan asked, his voice wary. You'll find out soon enough, Thomas replied, stepping out of the car. Inside, Ryan was greeted by the sight of children's drawings, shelves filled with donated goods, and a group of volunteers sorting through clothing and books. It was a local community centre, a place Ryan had driven past countless times, but never bothered to notice. This is where Mr. Samuels was heading before you stopped him, Thomas explained. He's been volunteering here for over a decade, helping families who don't have much. Ryan looked around, unease growing in his chest. A young boy approached, his face lighting up when he spotted Thomas. Chief Thomas, did you bring more books? Not today, Timmy, Thomas said with a warm smile. But I think Officer Ryan here has something to say. Ryan glared at Thomas, his frustration bubbling over. Why are we here? What's the point of this? The point, Thomas said, his tone cold, is to show you the impact of your actions. You knocked over a cart full of books meant for kids like Timmy. You humiliated a man who spends his life helping others. And you did it because you let your prejudice and ego get in the way. Ryan clenched his fists, but he couldn't meet Thomas's gaze. The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in. A woman approached, her face tired but kind. Is everything all right? She asked. Thomas nodded. Just showing Officer Ryan what this place is about, he said, and why people like Mr. Samuels deserve our respect. The woman smiled. He's one of the best. Always bringing in books, helping organize events. The kids love him. Ryan felt a pang of guilt, but remained silent. Thomas turned to him, his eyes hard. You need to make this right, he said. Starting now. Back at the hospital, Ryan entered Mr. Samuel's room reluctantly. The old man was sitting up in bed, a bandage on his side, but a faint smile on his face. Maria was by his side, holding a bouquet of flowers someone from the community center had sent. Ryan hesitated, then cleared his throat. Mr. Samuels, he began, his voice low. I'm sorry for what I did. I was out of line. Mr. Samuels looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. It's not me you need to apologize to, son. It's this community. They're the ones who lose when people like you forget what your badge is supposed to stand for. Ryan's chest tightened. I'll do better, he said, the words sounding hollow, even to himself. You'll have to prove it, Thomas said from the doorway. And that starts today. The hospital room was thick with silence, as Ryan's apology hung in the air. Mr. Samuels studied him, his aged eyes carrying a wisdom that seemed to pierce through Ryan's fragile attempts at remorse. The tension was palpable, and Maria crossed her arms, watching intently to see if Ryan truly understood the gravity of his actions. Words are easy, officer, Mr. Samuels finally said, his voice calm but firm. But do you know what your actions cost today? Do you even realize what you almost destroyed? Ryan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Mr. Samuels gestured to Maria. Maria, show him. Maria hesitated, but then pulled out her phone and scrolled through a series of photos. She handed it to Ryan, who stared at the screen, his expression shifting from confusion to unease. The images were of smiling children holding books, gathered around Mr. Samuels at the community center. Their faces lit up with joy as they read, their eyes wide with wonder. That's what you almost took away, Maria said, her tone sharp. Those kids don't have much, but they have hope because of Mr. Samuels. And you, Almost shattered that, over your arrogance. Ryan's throat tightened. The weight of her words and the images on the screen began to chip away at the wall of denial he had built around himself. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You didn't care to know, Thomas interjected, stepping into the room. His voice carried the authority of a man who had spent decades upholding the values Ryan had so carelessly ignored. You saw an old man and made assumptions. You used your power to demean him instead of protecting him. That's not just a failure as a cop, it's a failure as a human being. Ryan swallowed hard, his usual bravado completely stripped away. What can I do? He asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Mr. Samuels leaned forward, wincing slightly as he adjusted himself in bed. You can start by listening, he said. You've spent so much time talking down to people. You've forgotten how to hear their stories. If you want to make this right, you need to open your eyes to the world around you. Thomas nodded in agreement. And it doesn't stop there. Apologies are meaningless without action. You're going to work at that community center, Ryan, not as a cop, but as a volunteer. You're going to see what it means to serve without expecting anything in return. Ryan's head snapped up. You want me to work there? For how long? For as long as it takes, Thomas replied, his tone unwavering. Until you understand the responsibility that comes with that badge. The gravity of the punishment began to settle on Ryan's shoulders. He wanted to protest, to argue that this wasn't fair, but deep down, he knew he had no ground to stand on. Fine, he said reluctantly. I'll do it. The next morning, Ryan arrived at the community center, his uniform replaced by a plain t-shirt and jeans. He felt out of place, his presence met with curious glances and wary eyes. Maria was there to greet him, her expression skeptical but cautiously optimistic. Glad you showed up, she said. Let's see if you're serious about this. Ryan's first task was simple but humbling, sorting through boxes of donated goods. As he worked, he overheard conversations, laughter, and stories from the volunteers around him. These were people who had faced struggles he couldn't even imagine. Single parents working 2 jobs, immigrants trying to build a better life, and retirees like Mr. Samuels dedicating their time to helping others. By the end of the day, Ryan was exhausted but strangely fulfilled. He watched as children flocked to the shelves of books he had helped organize, their faces lighting up as they found new treasures to read. For the first time, he began to understand what Mr. Samuels had meant about listening and seeing the world differently. A week later, Ryan was cleaning up after a community event when he noticed Mr. Samuels sitting in a corner, quietly reading to a group of children. The sight stirred something inside him, a mix of guilt, admiration, and a longing to be better. Mr. Samuels, Ryan said, approaching cautiously. Can I talk to you? The old man looked up, his expression neutral. Go ahead. Ryan took a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about listening, and I'm sorry. Not just for what I did to you, but for all the people I've ignored or dismissed. I see now that being a cop isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about understanding the people you serve. Mr. Samuel studied him for a moment, then nodded. It's a start, he said, but words will only take you so far. Ryan nodded. I know. That's why I'm here. For the first time, Mr. Samuels smiled. A small, genuine smile that carried a hint of approval. Keep showing up, he said. You might surprise yourself. Weeks turned into months. And Ryan's time at the community center began to reshape him in ways he never expected. What started as a punishment gradually became a calling. Each day brought new lessons, not just about the people he served, but about himself. The arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by humility, and his interactions with others were now driven by empathy rather than authority. One afternoon, as Ryan was helping a group of kids sort through a new batch of donated books, Mr. Samuels entered the room. His steps were slow, but his presence commanded attention. The children rushed to greet him, their excitement palpable. Ryan watched as the man who had been the target of his prejudice weeks ago brought pure joy to the room. After the kids settled down, Mr. Samuels approached Ryan. "You've been putting in the work," he said, his tone soft but measured. "That's a good start, but you need to keep going." Ryan nodded. "I will. This place, it's shown me what I've been missing. I can't change the past, but I can do better moving forward." Mr. Samuels smiled faintly, his eyes filled with both wisdom and forgiveness. "That's all anyone can do." The pivotal moment came during a town event hosted at the community center. Hundreds of residents gathered to celebrate the center's achievements, and Ryan was among the volunteers working tirelessly to ensure everything went smoothly. As he directed traffic and helped set up tables, he noticed Maria watching him from across the room. "You're different now," Maria said, walking over. Her tone wasn't skeptical this time. It was genuine. Ryan shrugged, a faint smile on his face. "I had a lot to learn, still do." "Well, keep at it," Maria replied. "People are noticing." The event concluded with a small ceremony honoring Mr. Samuels for his decades of service to the community. Ryan stood in the back, clapping along with the crowd as the man he had wronged received the recognition he deserved. It was a humbling moment, one that cemented Ryan's newfound respect for the community and his place within it. Later that evening, as the center emptied out, Ryan found himself alone with Thomas. The retired chief had been watching him closely over the past few months, waiting to see if the young officer truly understood the lesson he'd been taught. "Well?" Ryan asked, his voice tentative. "What do you think?" Thomas crossed his arms, studying him for a moment before nodding. "You've come a long way, Ryan. But remember, this isn't a finish line. It's a new starting point." "I know," Ryan said earnestly. "I'm ready to keep proving myself." Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of approval. "Then, make sure you do." As Ryan drove home that night, he reflected on how much had changed. The man who had once seen power as a tool for control now understood it as a responsibility to serve. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was part of a community, one he had learned to see, hear, and respect. What do you think? Can people like Ryan truly change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.